He wasn't a soldier who followed orders. He was the orders. When Heinrich Himmler, the most feared man in Nazi Germany, needed someone to do the things even he hesitated to put in writing, he called one man, Odilo Globocnik. And when the war ended, when the Reich crumbled, when the bunkers fell silent and the flags came down, this man didn't face a courtroom. He didn't face a firing squad. He faced something far more personal. And what happened in that Austrian mountain room in May 1945, historians still argue about to this day. Most people have never heard the name Odilo Globocnik. And that, right there, is one of the most disturbing facts about the Holocaust. Because the men who actually ran the machinery of genocide, who built the death camps, who coordinated the murder of nearly 2 million Jews and hundreds of thousands of others, some of them nearly vanished from history entirely, but not from our channel. Welcome to X History, where we don't sanitize the past, where we go to the places historians go, we read the documents, we follow the evidence, and we give you the full picture, not the comfortable version, the true version. Because understanding history, really understanding it, means looking at the parts that make you uncomfortable, the parts that remind you what human beings are capable of when ideology replaces conscience. And Odilo Globocnik, he is one of the darkest case studies in that question. Before we go further, if this is your first time on X History, hit subscribe right now. We cover the stories that major channels won't touch, the real ones, the ones with weight. And if you've been here before, you already know what's coming. Let's get into it. To understand how Globocnik died, you first have to understand how he lived. He was born in 1904 in Trieste, which back then was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a world that was already cracking at the edges, already heading toward the catastrophe of World War I. Globocnik grew up in that collapse. He watched an empire dissolve around him, and like so many young men of his generation, he came out the other side angry, displaced, and desperate for someone to blame. He found the Nazi Party. But here's what's important, and this is where most people get the history wrong. Globocnik didn't just join the Nazi Party the way someone joins a gym membership. He became a true believer, fanatical, obsessive. He joined the Austrian Nazi Party in 1931, 2 years before Hitler even came to power in Germany, at a time when being a Nazi in Austria was actually illegal. Think about that for a second. This man risked arrest, risked his career, risked everything, because he believed, completely, totally, that kind of conviction is rare. And in the Nazi hierarchy, it was valuable. By the mid-1930s, Globocnik had made himself indispensable to the Austrian Nazi underground. He was smuggling propaganda, recruiting members, running illegal operations right under the Austrian government's nose. He was, by any measure, a talented operative, but he was also reckless. In 1938, the same year Austria was annexed into the Third Reich, the same year crowds lined the streets of Vienna cheering as Hitler rode through, Globocnik was actually removed from his position as Gauleiter of Vienna. Why? Because even by Nazi standards, his financial corruption had become embarrassing. He'd been caught using party funds for personal gain. And here's the rom-com twist of the darkest possible variety. The man who would go on to oversee the murder of nearly 2 million people nearly ended his Nazi career because he couldn't stop stealing money. He was demoted. But Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, the architect of the SS Empire, saw something in Globocnik that others dismissed. Himmler looked at this corrupt, reckless, fanatical Austrian and thought, I can use this. So in 1941, Himmler made a decision that would change the history of the Holocaust forever. He gave Globocnik a new assignment. Not a desk job, not a minor administrative role as punishment for his corruption. No, Himmler sent him to Lublin, Poland. And in Lublin, Odilo Globocnik would build something that has no equivalent in human history. Something so vast, so systematic, so deliberately hidden from the world, that when Allied soldiers finally uncovered the evidence, grown men wept and couldn't stop. He was given command of what would become known as Operation Reinhard, the plan to murder every Jewish person in occupied Poland, every single one, and the machinery he built to do it, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, those names should stop you cold. Because they weren't concentration camps in the way most people picture. They weren't places of detention or forced labor. They were places built with one purpose. You arrived, and within hours, you were gone. Operation Reinhard had a name that sounds almost bureaucratic, almost clean. But there was nothing clean about it. Globocnik received his orders in late 1941, and he moved with a speed that shocked even his superiors. Within months, he had construction crews working around the clock in the forests of occupied Poland. He had train schedules coordinated. He had staff recruited, armed, and stationed. He had built, almost from nothing, an industrial system of death that the world had never seen before and has never seen since. The first camp, Belzec, became operational in March 1942. By the end of that year, it had consumed the lives of approximately 430,000 people. Let that number sit for a moment. 430,000 human beings in less than 12 months in one camp. And Globocnik wasn't running this from a comfortable office in Berlin. He was there, present, involved. He visited the camps. He reviewed the operations. He corresponded directly with Himmler about the progress, using coded language in their letters, referring to mass murder as resettlement and victims as units. But everyone knew exactly what those words meant. Here's the thing that historians point to again and again when studying Globocnik. He wasn't just following orders in the passive, mechanical sense that some perpetrators later claimed. He was enthusiastic. He pushed for faster timelines. He expanded operations beyond what was originally planned. He wrote to Himmler requesting more resources, more manpower, more trains. He wanted to finish the job, and that distinction between reluctant executor and true believer matters enormously when we try to understand how ordinary bureaucracies become engines of atrocity. Now, here is where the history gets complicated in a way most people don't know. Globocnik also had enemies inside the SS, inside the Nazi hierarchy itself, because power in the Third Reich wasn't clean or simple. It was a constant war of competing fiefdoms, personal rivalries, and backstabbing ambition. And Globocnik, with his history of financial corruption, his reckless personality, his habit of accumulating personal wealth from the property seized from Holocaust victims, made powerful enemies. There were SS investigations into his conduct, not for the murders. Nobody in that system was being investigated for the murders. They were investigating him for stealing from the Reich, the gold teeth pulled from victims, the jewelry, the cash. Some of it was being diverted, and fingers pointed at Globocnik. The man overseeing the largest murder operation in human history was also running what amounted to a personal theft operation inside it. If this were fiction, you'd reject it as too dark, too absurd. But this is history, and history doesn't care about your comfort. By 1943, the tide of the war was turning. Stalingrad had fallen. The German Sixth Army, once considered invincible, had been shattered on the Eastern Front, and quietly, in the corridors of power in Berlin, people who had never allowed themselves to imagine defeat were starting to imagine it. Globocnik felt it too. And here's where something remarkable happens. Remarkable in its cold, calculated horror. As the Red Army pushed westward, Globocnik received new orders. The camps had to be dismantled. The evidence had to be erased. The bodies, hundreds of thousands of them, had to be exhumed and burned. This operation was called Aktion 1005. Teams of prisoners, many of them survivors of the very camps being erased, were forced to dig up mass graves and incinerate the remains. And when the work was done, those prisoners were killed too. Globocnik was methodically destroying the evidence of what he had built. He understood that if Germany lost, and now he was beginning to believe it might, those camps could not be allowed to tell their story. But history has a way of preserving what murderers try to destroy. Survivors escaped. Witnesses talked. Documents were hidden by courageous individuals who understood that someday, someone would need to know. And the physical evidence, despite everything, remained. Scattered teeth, fragments of personal belongings, the ground itself, which refused to lie flat over mass graves, creating depressions in the earth that aerial photographs later captured in damning detail. You can burn bodies, You cannot burn truth. In late 1943, Himmler finally made a move that surprised many. He transferred Globocnik out of Lublin. On the surface, it looked like a reassignment. Globocnik was sent to Trieste, his birthplace, as higher SS and police leader of the Adriatic coastal region. But read between the lines of history and you see something else. Himmler was distancing himself. The man who had championed Globocnik, who had given him the assignment of a lifetime, who had protected him from internal SS investigations, was now quietly stepping back, creating space, because Himmler, above almost everyone else in the Reich, understood how to read which way the wind was blowing. And the wind, by late 1943, was blowing cold. Globocnik threw himself into his new role with characteristic intensity. In Trieste, he oversaw brutal anti-partisan operations against Italian resistance fighters and Yugoslav partisans. He deported Jews from the Italian-occupied territories. He continued, almost compulsively, the same patterns of violence and administration that had defined his career. But something had shifted in the man. People who knew him in this period, SS officers, administrators, local officials, later described a Globocnik who seemed simultaneously frantic and fatalistic. He was working with the same ferocious energy, but underneath it, there was something new. Fear, not of the partisans, not of military defeat, fear of what came after defeat, because Odilo Globocnik knew, better than almost anyone alive, exactly what he had done. He had the numbers in his head. He had walked those camps. He had read those reports. He knew the scale of it in a way that the outside world did not yet fully comprehend. And he knew that if the Allies won, they would eventually come looking. By early 1945, Germany was collapsing on every front. The Soviet army was driving toward Berlin from the east. American and British forces had crossed into Germany from the west. The Reich that was supposed to last 1,000 years was going to be over before it reached its 13th. Globocnik fled. He made his way into the Austrian Alps, the Carinthian mountains, with a small group of SS loyalists. They had false papers. They had weapons. They had a plan to disappear into the Austrian countryside and wait for the chaos to settle. It was, all things considered, a reasonable plan. It almost worked. On May 31st, 1945, just weeks after Hitler's suicide in the Berlin bunker, British forces acting on intelligence received a tip. There was a group of SS men hiding in a mountain hut near Weissensee in Carinthia. A British patrol moved in. And when they pushed open that door, they found him, Odilo Globocnik, architect of Operation Reinhard, the man Himmler had trusted above almost all others, the man responsible for the deaths of nearly 2 million people, sitting there. Caught. What happened in that room in the next few minutes is where historians still disagree. The British soldiers who entered that mountain hut in Carinthia on May 31st, 1945, were not historians. They were tired men, young men, men who had spent years fighting across Europe, who had seen things that would follow them for the rest of their lives. They weren't looking for a philosophical moment. They were looking for SS fugitives, and they found one, Odilo Globocnik, the man who had built the infrastructure of genocide, who had overseen the murder of approximately 1.7 million human beings, was sitting in that hut wearing civilian clothes, attempting to pass as an ordinary Austrian civilian. The disguise didn't hold. Someone had talked. The British had a name, and when they matched the face to the file, everything moved very fast. What happened next is where the historical record becomes genuinely contested. And this is important because the how of Globocnik's death carries enormous weight, not just for closure, but for what it reveals about accountability, about justice, and about what the world was willing to do and not do with the men who had engineered the Holocaust. The official account, accepted by most mainstream historians, is this: within minutes of being positively identified by British forces, Odilo Globocnik bit down on a cyanide capsule concealed in his mouth. He was dead within minutes. No trial, no testimony, no courtroom, no public accounting. Gone. Now, here is where you need to pay close attention, because this is the part most YouTube channels skip entirely. The cyanide capsule story raises immediate questions that serious historians have never fully resolved. Where did the capsule come from? Globocnik had been on the run for weeks, moving through chaotic, collapsing territory. He had been hiding in a mountain hut with limited supplies. Yet somehow, he had maintained possession of a functioning cyanide capsule. Through all of it, that's possible. Senior SS officers were known to carry them. Himmler himself died the same way, just 2 weeks earlier on May 23, 1945, also by cyanide capsule, also in British custody, also within minutes of being identified. Convenient timing, identical method. 2 of the most knowledgeable men in the entire SS hierarchy, both dead, before they could be formally questioned. Some historians note this pattern and leave it as a pattern. Others have gone further. A minority of researchers, working from witness testimonies collected in the decades after the war, have suggested that Globocnik's death was not entirely self-administered, that in the chaos and rage of that immediate post-war moment, with British soldiers staring at a man they now understood had overseen the murder of nearly 2 million people, the line between suicide and execution may have blurred. There is no definitive proof of this, but there is also no definitive proof against it. And that ambiguity, that gap in the historical record, is itself a kind of statement about how the world processed the perpetrators of the Holocaust in those first raw, overwhelming weeks after the war ended. Justice was not always a courtroom. Sometimes it was a room in the mountains. Sometimes it was a man reaching into his own mouth. And sometimes history simply doesn't tell you which one it was. What we know for certain is this. Odilo Globocnik was buried without ceremony in the Carinthian mountains. No funeral, no marker that would last, no formal acknowledgement beyond military records. The man who had commanded an operation of almost incomprehensible scale, who had built 3 death camps, coordinated thousands of personnel, and processed the murder of nearly 2 million human beings in under 2 years, received less ceremony in death than any one of his victims had deserved in life. There is something in that inversion that feels important, not satisfying, not just, but important. Because justice, real justice, would have meant a trial. It would have meant testimony. It would have meant Globocnik sitting in a room like the one at Nuremberg, having to speak his own name out loud, having to answer questions about Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, having to explain, in front of the world, in front of survivors, what he had ordered, what he had visited, what he had approved that never happened. And that absence matters. The Nuremberg trials, which began in November 1945, put 24 of the highest-ranking Nazi leaders on trial. It was an extraordinary moment in legal history, the first time that crimes against humanity were prosecuted on an international stage, the first time that following orders was explicitly rejected as a legal defense. But Globocnik wasn't there. Neither was Himmler. Neither was Hitler, the 3 men who, between them, bore the greatest direct responsibility for the Holocaust, all dead by their own hand before a single indictment was read. And so the Nuremberg trials, as historic and necessary as they were, prosecuted a version of the Holocaust slightly removed from its most direct architects, the men who actually ran the camps, who built them, who staffed them, who walked through them and checked the numbers and wrote the reports. Many of them faced justice later. Some never faced it at all. Operation Reinhard. Globocnik's operation was named after Reinhard Heydrich, the SS general who had been assassinated by Czech resistance fighters in May 1942. Heydrich had been one of the primary architects of the final solution. Naming the murder operation after him was, in the twisted logic of the SS, an honor. When researchers and prosecutors tried to fully document Operation Reinhard after the war, they faced an enormous challenge. Globocnik, with characteristic thoroughness, had destroyed most of the paperwork. The same meticulous organization that had built the camps had been turned toward erasing them. But not everything was destroyed. A small number of documents survived. Fragments of correspondence between Globocnik and Himmler, partial records, and crucially, survivors Men and women who had escaped from Sobibor, from Treblinka, who had lived to tell the world exactly what those places were. Their testimony became the foundation of our historical understanding of Operation Reinhard. They are the reason we know his name. They are the reason we can tell this story. So what do we take from the life and death of Odilo Globocnik? Not comfort. There is no comfort here, but there is something essential, something that every person who watches history content should carry with them. Globocnik was not a monster in the way we use that word to create distance. He was not a creature from another species. He was a man, born in a city, raised in a family. He had ambitions, frustrations, career failures, moments of embarrassment. He was corrupt and reckless and charismatic and utterly, completely human. And that is the most disturbing thing about him. Because the Holocaust was not carried out by monsters. It was carried out by human beings who made choices, who chose ideology over conscience, who chose obedience over morality, who looked at other human beings and chose to see categories instead of people. Understanding that, really understanding it, is the only defense we have against it happening again. History is not a collection of safe, distant stories about people who weren't like us. It is a mirror. And Odilo Globocnik, buried without ceremony in an Austrian mountain, dead before he could answer for what he had done, is one of the darkest reflections in that mirror. He escaped a courtroom. He did not escape history. And as long as channels like this one exist, as long as people like you choose to understand rather than look away, he never will. If this video gave you something, a new understanding, a new name to research, a new way of thinking about how ordinary people become perpetrators of extraordinary evil, then share it. Put it in front of someone who needs to see it. Subscribe to X History if you haven't already. We do this work seriously. We do it honestly. And we do it because these stories deserve to be told properly. The next video is already coming. And trust me, you're going to want to be here for it.